This actually is a project that goes back some years in its sort of gestation, and under discussion with Jeff Stonehouse for a number of years. We talked about the possibility of doing a piece that could act as a companion work to Ravel's Introduction and Allegro, which of course is a very prominent piece in the harp repertoire specifically, and Robin, as a close colleague of, is Robin Best, the wonderful harpist for this concert, as a close colleague of myself and Jeff, we talked about doing this mutual project that could pair potentially with Ravel's work. So it was under discussion for quite a long time, and I guess there was some uncertainty about when it would finally come to fruition, and it just so happens that it comes to fruition under very unusual circumstances indeed. But I tried to adapt as well as I could to the new circumstances, which maybe I can talk about some more later. But it certainly did require me to discard a lot of previous ideas I had about the piece, because of course it's a very new situation. But that's not always a bad thing. I think sometimes it's good as composers to be jolted and to force to think through things very differently. So I tried to embrace the opportunity in the piece. Well, again, early on in our conception of the project, it was intended, I think, to be a literal companion work to Ravel. But then when Jeff approached me about writing the piece formally this summer, he sort of loosened that a little bit. He said, "This will be on the program, but I don't want to impose anything on you," which was certainly to his credit. He sort of gave me the option. Um, Ravel, I mean, Ravel is a very prominent composer in my life and in a lot of composers' lives. He has a certain approach to orchestration that is unlike any other composer, and he would be, I would say, especially with regard to orchestration and thinking about instrumentation and instrumental blend, he is one of the great masters, and certainly for me, I would say among two or three of the composers in history that have taught me the most. And every so often, even now when I'm thinking about an orchestral score, I still have, you'll actually see behind me, there are scores by Ravel that I'll just open up and just say, what did he do here? And because it is so immaculate the way that he thought about that. So I suppose his approach to instrumental blend and orchestral textures is the most influential for me. And I don't know his chamber music as well, but his chamber music is very particular as well, in that they also, in a sense, occupy an orchestral space in a very bizarre and interesting way. He has a way through a synthesis of his, again, approach to instrumental blend, but also the musical language itself, of projecting this sense of musical space that goes far beyond usually the forces that are at his disposal. So for instance, it's piano trio, or this piece, the Introduction and Allegro, has these big sweeping gestures that appear to really transcend the medium for which he's writing. So that's certainly true in the Introduction and Allegro. And as far as my piece, I certainly try to cultivate a good ear for that sort of instrumental blend, and there are certain markings. I'm not sure I would be the best person to identify where in my score, those those sort of links exist, but I'm sure they are. But of course, again, going back to the circumstances of this piece, because it's in a wide open space, and maybe I'll talk later a little bit about how I thought that through. That also, the spatial disposition of players really can have a profound impact on how they sound together and the way that the audience hears it when they're not just arranged as one in front of people. That changes. It gives more. It can, in effect, mitigate the sense of ensemble playing to the advantage of individual instruments. So that had to be taken into account in I think an interesting way. Certainly, it did. I'm not usually one for whom the external world has a lot of bearing on my music. I try to keep it separate for the most part. It's usually what's most healthy for me artistically, but this was such an overwhelming social and global situation that it was sort of inescapable that would have an impact on it. So yeah, this sort of has to do with the work's title, I guess, Coda. I wrote the piece mostly in the first half of the summer. This is when we were still really just coming to understand what was going on in the world. And again, this was part of the project of discarding previous ideas about the piece, because it couldn't be ignored what was going on in the world. So at that time, there was a lot of uncertainty, certainly about, at least in our world, the future of music and the future of musical performance and communal music making. So I felt just sort of organically, I felt the need to, maybe this is my own personality, but instead of speculating so much about the future and what this could be, I was sort of looking backwards at that time and thinking about what maybe we had lost in that time. And so there's a bit of a sense of looking back with a bit of, I don't know, a little bit of sorrow about just the ability to make music together, which is such an important part of my life. And also it seemed to be a time not to make any grand pronouncements or any grand artistic visions. This was not really the environment for that. So as a result, the work is somewhat fragmentary. It's a little bit wistful, I guess. It's not it's not a big bold statement. It's sort of a reflection more than anything else. That's a really important part of the piece. So the first thing was to communicate with Jeff about the space that was going to be used. I wanted to immediately, I guess I'm thinking pragmatically here. I wanted to write a piece that would be very suitable to that space, but at the same time, you're not trying to write a piece that can only be played in one place. So I wanted to sort of walk that line, so to speak. I had attended performances, at least one in the sanctuary at Le Jésus, so I had a sense of it, but I didn't quite remember exactly what the acoustic was or how large that the front stage area was. So he sent me, I had to do some research. I was actually on the website looking at different seating capacities and stage layouts and that sort of thing, because I knew there was some flexibility involved in that. And I got a picture somewhere. I dug up a picture online just to have. And of course, we had this requirement for physical distancing to take into account. And actually, this was something I had explored in a previous work to a small degree. In 2015, I wrote a piece it was an unusual piece, but it was for a string trio and a trio of voices, soprano, mezzo-soprano, and tenor, I believe. And actually, in that work, I also experimented, not out of any necessity, but just out of my own my own creative impulse, to distribute the string players somewhat spatially around the stage to create a sort of outer sonic environment that could sort of enclose the singers and to create a sort of layering and a sort of a sense of perspective, almost like a foreground and background. And I think my music, even without that spatial distribution, sometimes plays with that tension. So that was immediately where my mind went. I actually thought this could be a really cool opportunity. So then you start thinking, okay, we have 7 instruments. Of course, they could be scattered in any which way. I believe Zasha's piece on the program has a very particular arrangement of the instruments also. But I suppose because of my inclination to think about instrumental type specifically, I wanted to separate the string quartet from the other 3 instruments, and just to see what that would be like. Because in setting up that tension, then all of a sudden you can create a lot of different dynamic properties in the music. So what I did was I chose to take the string quartet and arrange them in a sort of square formation around the remaining 3 instruments, the flute, the harp, and the clarinet. And I also gave them mutes. So almost throughout the entire piece, the string instruments have leather mutes, so rather heavy mutes on, to help contribute to this effect of them being more distanced and more in the background. And that was my starting point. And of course, in doing that, it creates, well, there are trade-offs that come compositionally, because you can create really interesting spatial effects, but it does lead to challenges in terms of coordination, right? And these sort of things, because your lines of sight aren't the same. In fact, I have this diagram in my office where I was writing down, okay, who has eye contact with who can see who? So because there's going to be no conductor, of course. So if there's an important cue in the music, who will be giving it? So what I thought about was, okay, if I put Jeff, because Jeff, I've seen him perform many, many times, and he likes to be almost like a conductor on stage. He likes to lead. And then traditionally in a string quartet, the first violinist will act as a sort of cueing person. So I started out by creating a sort of visual axis between Jeff and the first violinist, so that they could coordinate their things. So in moments when the two different instrumental groups were acting differently or together, they could have a very clear line of sight. And then I sort of filled it in around from there. And I gave them some flexibility in terms of how they could arrange themselves, but the general model was to have the trio in the middle and then the four instruments around that. And actually, originally, I was leaning more toward a more, let's say, a soundscape style of music, and actually having the string players really far away and actually behind the audience, which I had experienced in other pieces, like Georg Friedrich Haas's Third String Quartet, for example, which positions the string quartet around the audience. But as I started to write the piece, I discovered that it was just a little bit too distant from my just natural way of music making to have the instruments sort of behave in that way. I needed more ensemble playing. So I asked him to bring the string players into the stage, but still be on the outer edges of the stage. So everyone will be on stage, but they'll still have their distance, and there'll still be a sense of background and foreground, hopefully, through that. Anyway, that's a lot of information. So I wouldn't be able to pinpoint one thing in particular, but the piece is somewhat episodic. There are sort of moments, it's a passage between moments, and there's some degree of contrast between those in order to amplify the sense of contrast between those. So there are moments in the piece that are highly chromatic, perhaps more so than Ravel. Although the interesting thing is when the harp serves as a central instrument, that sort of bakes in a lot of let's say a lot of obligations and restrictions as far as the pitch content, right? Because of the seven potential, the limitation of 7 notes per octave, or less. So that already creates interesting compositional restrictions. So I worked within that, but yeah, throughout it sort of passes between moments of heavy chromaticism and sort of chromatic flourishes, and then moments that are more diatonic and more consonant. And so that's a sort of dialectic that I set up in the piece that's pretty common for me. That might, I don't know, might sound inconsistent, but hopefully over the whole global sense of the piece amount to something coherent. And actually there's one part near the end of the piece where there's a sort of unusual, very big, very sonorous consonant wash of sound. And it's in a sense my homage to Ravel that is very, very noticeably outside of the fully more dense chromatic music. Well, the harp is it's very peculiar, because on the one hand it has its own very unique sound, which usually, let's say in an orchestral context, a harp serves somewhat limited purpose, right? It's a moment instrument, so it comes out to sort of amplify big moments, but it's not a sort of core instrument. And there is a sort of select collection of orchestral sounds where the harp really can flourish. But it's also it's very flexible. And so with this instrumentation in particular, it's so interesting to have as the only really important piece of repertoire, the one piece, the Ravel, to use as a precedent, because he has a very particular way of writing for these instruments. But of course, what you have is the very complementary sounds that can be had with a string quartet, especially when they're with the pizzicato. So you you can, on the one hand, you can have textures where the harp really stands out. So it's versus the harp as a plucked instrument versus 6 instruments that, let's say, are more melodic or more, more phrase oriented. But if you were to deploy the string quartet in a pizzicato fashion, then all of a sudden, all the balance shifts and you have a plucked ensemble and you have just 2 woodwinds that are on their own. So it's a sort of, it's a transitional instrument, and it can function in different ways depending on what you put around it. So it's important. I felt that it was important to think of it very centrally, and that goes in part to my decision to place it at the center of the stage so that it could be heard as a sort of again, a sort of nucleus around which the rest of the instruments could be heard in relation to it. That's a tough question. This piece is one of my shorter works, actually. It's only about 7.5 minutes, so I want to refrain a little bit from making a big, and also because the work, as I said earlier, occupies a lot of different spaces. It's the framing, let's say, conceptual worlds of the piece, the way that it enters and the way that it exits, is very austere. It's very it is mysterious and nebulous in a way. More than some of my other music is more declamatory. So this was one of the things, again, responding to the nature of the harp, which itself is a sort of mysterious instrument. I wanted to write something that was a little bit more invitational and a little bit less, I don't know, well, you never want to write didactic music, but something a little bit less, I don't know, serious, I guess. So I took that as, again, my framing function. But there are other moments in the piece where there's playfulness. There are moments of, I guess, passion. It covers a lot of terrain, actually. It's a little bit experimental, actually, for me. It's almost like maybe it's a piece that in a few years I'll look back to as a sort of experimental piece for me, because I'm sort of trying on these different, it's quite restless, actually. But as usual, I think it's good to explore these different things, and even if they don't totally cohere in one piece, they could amount to something more coherent in the future. So I think it's important to experiment with those things, and it's only until after I really hear the recording, and I've had some initial feedback from rehearsals and that sort of thing, but I really think you have to wait till the finished product, and then I'll be able to give a better answer for that. I think I covered most of what I wanted to say. It's pretty comprehensive. I guess I just wanted to thank the musicians once more for their dedication. I know they put a lot of rehearsal into it, and there's new circumstances that they have to adapt to as well. That are new challenges, certainly. And I'm very sad to not be able to be there. I live in the U.S. and it was just not, with the quarantine and everything, it was not going to be possible. But I'll definitely be there in spirit, and I'll look forward to the recording. And again, I salute all their great efforts in preparing the work.